a presentation from Jon Ingham, which in my view promises to be a bit provocative, if I can say so. Jon is a consultant, a trainer, a writer and speaker on strategic people and organizational topics, with, I believe, a specific focus on social relationships. And Jon has been a widely recognized top global influencer in talent management. So we are very proud. I'm very happy that I can introduce Jon now to you all. So I'm really anxious to learn more about Jon's view on the future of doing business, because I believe that he's convinced that work is going to stay remote, which requires organizations and people teams to shift to a more asynchronous mode of working. I must say that I have maybe a more balanced view on this, but I would like to first listen to Jon, and then maybe we can have a further discussion later on. So Jon, over to you now.
Thank you, Rita and Tom, and absolutely look forward to some interesting discussion on these topics as we progress at the end of the session. So absolutely. So I am a strategic HR consultant. I do some writing as well. So I'm the author of a recent book, The Social Organisation, and I do talk about some of these issues, particularly around distributed network organisations in that book and elsewhere. But I do think that, albeit all of the things I'm going to be talking about were really very important prior to the pandemic, they're even more so now. Although it's a shame not to be in Barcelona or Amsterdam or and with everybody physically, it's great to have the opportunity to talk in the conference about how I think things are going to have to change. Oh yes, and just in terms of my title on the slide, well, in fact, so I'll mention this very quickly, partly as a result of the pandemic and the need, I think, for organizations to have to become more asynchronous. Probably my main focus at the moment is setting up and delivering learning through a new strategic HR academy. So when I'm not on remote virtual conferences, that's what I'm doing most of the time. My focus is very much around strategic HR, and one of my key beliefs about that topic is that HR can be more strategic when we focus on best fit alignment with the businesses that we're operating in and the external environment, which I guess is the your cube, Tom, that you were talking about later. I mean, I love Tom. I love the trends that you've taken us through. I suppose these criteria, these attributes of HR moving through and beyond COVID, to me are opportunities, not necessarily trends. So Ruta, I agree, not everybody's going to be working remotely, but I do think that is an opportunity that at the very least, and certainly if I was still an HR director today, one of the things that I'd want to be thinking about for my organization is what are the opportunities because of working remotely, and I think these other factors which link to that as well. And these factors I've just summarized into as hard HR. So we know that HR is going to continue to be difficult, and I'm going to explain why I think for some organizations at least, HR is also going to be hard. So that's about heterogeneous, asynchronous, remote, and distributed. I just want to take you through those 4 attributes and explain sort of broadly what I mean by those, and then there are some consequences of those shifts which I'd like to spend some time on explaining with you. So we're not going to go through from the H. I do want to start with remote, because this is the reason for all of these changes. So the H, the A, the D are important as well, but remote is the driver. It is the fact that we've all been working at home for some time, and different countries are affected in different ways, and who knows what's going to be happening towards the end of winter in the northern hemisphere. But most people expect at least some greater level of remote working to carry on. And different organizations will need to do different things. Different individuals will want to respond in different ways. And to me, and one of the things which I'm going to try to address a little bit later on as well, is I think the piece which is missing in that consideration of future remote strategies is also the needs of groups and networks in our organizations. This it's not just about what organizations want and what individuals need. It's how do we bring individuals together into effective teams, and do those teams need to be together, or can they work remotely, or what is the balance or the blend or the sort of the hybrid working to enable that to take place. And I think the other key factor which relates to this, or the ongoing aspect of remote working, is to ensure that we're balancing the key needs of the business, the teams, and individuals as well. Remote can be it can be something which is very positive or very negative. There's not necessarily a particular consequence or sort of level of satisfaction with remote working. It does depend very much on the way it's done. And I think that's probably the case in lots of different aspects of HR as well. One of my roles until fairly recently in the UK was working with Glassdoor, helping them with some of their research. And in the UK, we have these 0-hour contracts where people can just sort of be asked to come in and do a piece of work without a traditional, formal, full-time, permanent employment contract. And these contracts get a lot of criticism, but certainly for the research that we did with Glassdoor, it depends on the organization and the way that they're used. Some organizations, these contracts are imposed on people simply to improve flexibility and manage risk for the organization, with no real thought about the individual employees. And in some organizations, they introduced to help employees gain flexibility from them. And therefore, the perceptions in Glassdoor and elsewhere, it's very, very different depending on the way that they're done. It's not the thing itself, it's about the intent behind the thing and the way that the thing is done. And I think remote is a perfect example of this. So we need to do it carefully, we need to do it appropriately, and we need to do it strategically. And I guess, I think HR in general did a superb job in reacting responsively to the pandemic and getting people out of the offices to work remotely. It was well executed, but it was a reactive response. As we move forward, we do need to think more proactively and strategically about how we can use the increased remote nature of the workforce to help organizations move forward. And I think one part of that is, if we're going to be remote, then people don't all need to be within sort of 10 miles of their office. We can open up our workforce potentially globally, which is a huge opportunity, but massive challenges in terms of, everything, employer branding and internal management and sort of everything that we do. So there's a lot of issues that we need to consider around remote working. And as soon as we work remotely and we try to work more remotely in a proactive and a more strategic way, I think the first thing that we do need to think very seriously about is working more asynchronous. We don't all need to be together talking with each other at the same time. This was quite evident for quite some time. I did an article in the couple of weeks just before lockdown in the UK, just talking about the fact that functional groups do not all need to get meetings every week. It's just a complete waste of time, because most people in functional groups spend most of their time working individually, and there are much better ways of coordinating. So again, through collaborative documents, through group chat, other things. So that's been the case for quite some time, but the pandemic has really brought it to the fore. As people have been spending so much time on Zoom or on calls in Microsoft Teams and so on. And although this is fundamentally an IT issue, HR needs to be working with our IT and digital colleagues to help develop individuals and teams and help create a better way of working. And if you have a look at all of the organizations which traditionally have worked remotely, like Buffer and Basecamp and GitLab and Zapier and so on, they all work in much more of an asynchronous ways, based upon principles around transparency, for example, this idea of working out loud, that you're helping other people see what you're doing. So it's much easier to collaborate and cooperate. Much higher levels of trust, or at least an attempt to sort of trust and track, check what people are doing, but basically trust that they will be doing the right thing. So trust and track rather than command and control. You still need to have the checkpoints in place so that if things aren't happening, but most of the time you can just leave people to get on with their work to a much higher level of an extent that we've done in the past. Other key things, a clear purpose, a North Star for people to focus on so that they know what they should be trying to achieve when they are working with a higher level of autonomy. Greater clarity, some clear cadence in terms of where people and teams should be coming together to work in a more synchronous way as well. We can't do everything through asynchronous communication, but we can certainly do a lot more than we have been, certainly over the last 6 months. And this is also where I wanted to talk just very briefly, just because it's the best example I have of what I'm doing in my Strategic HR Academy currently. So although my main background and focus has been to work as a strategic HR consultant, actually over the last couple of years, I've probably done more training on strategic HR than anything else. So every month I do sort of 5 or 6 days of face-to-face training. And obviously when lockdown took place, I moved all of that onto Zoom, which sort of worked. But again, as we've been saying about the conference, isn't quite the same experience as meeting face-to-face. But over the last couple of months, I've been moving that onto this digital academy, where we have the courses pre-recorded. We have study groups and chat rooms to talk about the courses and other areas of learning. And although it's early days, this I think it's certainly a much better learning experience than trying to recreate the same environment that we used to do, but just do it on Zoom, and potentially an even better learning experience than I used to. Why should everybody have to come together into a hotel room in London when you can just sort of spend half an hour today and half an hour tomorrow and just sort of crack on through some learning at your own pace? And although my business is a very simple business, in a large way, this is what all organizations need to go through. We've responded reactively to the situation we're in, just to continue business as usual in an unusual way. But we now sort of need to rethink from a very fundamental basis how we can do things better and differently to cope with the radically different environment that we're working in today. So that's so we've had a look at R for remote, A for asynchronous, the D is for distributed. And when I was first thinking about this presentation, that was sort of the three attributes that I wanted to describe, because I did think this idea of calling the presentation RAD HR, RAD being awesome, cool, because that basically, I think, does describe what HR is really like. And I think it's easy to forget that when we're, immersed in all of the difficult issues that we have to deal with. But HR is so cool. We are at the center of organizational success. And again, that's why that responding positively and strategically to the pandemic is so important, because the way that we do that is probably going to be the most fundamental factor in our organization's success. So RAD HR, I'd really encourage you to hold on to that idea, because I think we do need to be radical, both in terms of sort of transformational, but awesome and cool as well. But unfortunately, there is another factor that I wanted to talk about, which is being heterogeneous, and therefore hard HR is the best acronym I could come up with. So this is partly about traditional sources of diversity. There's clearly a lot more focus these days on ethnic diversity with Black Lives Matter, with gender diversity and so on. And all of those things are only ever going to become more important. But I also think, if you start having a look at the other factors, particularly remote and asynchronous, and therefore the ability to look for talent in all different areas of the world, clearly organizations are a lot more diverse than we ever have. A lot more national cultures perhaps involved in our different organizations, and therefore huge opportunities to become more innovative because of all of the different perspectives that we have in our organizations, but much more difficulty bringing all of that together as well. And when you've got that increased diversity inside an organization, as the slide says, why would you want just to employ all of these people? When we know, again, there's been this shift towards more contingent working for some time, and a lot of organizations going through real difficulties at the moment. As the economies in our different countries improve again, will organizations really simply want to sort of re-employ people and move back to the headcount that they've been on before? My suggestion would be probably not. So I think the key factor that I'd like to stress about the more heterogeneous workforce is this increasingly diverse makeup, these different workforce categories that we need to start having a look at. So this is my suggestion for the sort of 4 major areas of the workforce that you may want to think about building, moving towards. And I've developed this based upon Charles Handy's Shamrock organization that he was talking about decades and decades ago. So he used to talk about the core workforce, the people who are most important to your organizational success, who are employed and you really, really want to build an ongoing relationship with, and to ensure are engaged and contributing to the full. You may have a contract workforce who are people who are also important and have sort of key skills that you really need to ensure you've got ready access to, but you may not need those skills all the time, and therefore these people don't necessarily need to be employed. They may be former employees that you keep a call-off contract with, so you can just pull them in at a point that you need their particular capabilities. And then he also talked about the peripheral workforce who are employed in the organization, but don't necessarily have the same level of importance. If they were to resign and move on, it's not such a big thing because you can always find somebody to replace them. And I think this concept of gig mindset is really important for them as well. So it's not that they are gig workers, they are employed, but they're increasingly coming to an organization with a a perspective to treat their employment in the organization a bit like a gig. So as long as they're contributing effectively, they're developing, they're getting what they need out of their employment, fine, they'll stay. If not, they'll move on. And then the fourth leaf, which is the new one since Charles Handy's analysis, is the contingent workforce. So these are the gig workers. Now, I think the nice thing about making this a 4-leaved clover, the shamrock, rather than just 3 leaves, is that then that constructs this 2x2 matrix. So at the top, these are the most important skills and capabilities. At the bottom here, more generic skills. And then you can also have a look at, people who are so important that, or for whatever reason you want to employ them. It just makes sense to have them on your books for you to own them to some extent, or it's just easier just to rent that input of talent when you need them. We really need at the moment, because of the opportunity as well as the need to create a more heterogeneous workforce. I think we need to be thinking about all of those 4 opportunities. So that then does lead us on to the distributed nature of organizations. And again, so this is the key thing that I was talking about or writing about in my book, The Social Organization. So this isn't completely new because of the pandemic, but now that people are remote, now that we need to look at ways of enabling them to work in a more asynchronous way, now that they're more heterogeneous, I think it just makes sense to move to a more distributed way of working, where we're allowing people more autonomy to do the right thing at the point that they're working on in the organization, and not to try to centralize it, to command and control it all as we have done in the past. Coming from a consultancy background, and Tom and Wouter, this may resonate for you. Wouter, I'm sure it doesn't. I'm sure KPMG isn't like this at all. But when I was at EY, we used to talk about herding cats. That you've got all of these people wanting to do their own things, and trying to centralize all of that really just didn't make any sense. And I think all organizations will be increasingly like that too. Now, this is potentially the most complex of the 4 attributes, the hard attributes that I'm taking you through. So I've got an additional slide, or a couple of slides here, just to explain a little bit more about what I mean by a distributed organization. And I don't just mean remote. So people often talk about remote work as distributed work, because you're not just in an office anymore. And absolutely, people are now distributed geographically, but they're not necessarily distributed organizationally. And this is sort of what I mean. So these are the 3 main ways that we can organize people. In fact, we can organize anything. And these diagrams actually have nothing to do with people networks at all. So they were developed by Paul Barron back in the 1960s as part of some of the initial thinking about the internet. The different ways that we could link computer networks together. And this is why the internet is a distributed network, because distributed organization is the most robust and innovative way of connecting things, which is why the internet is as successful as it is. And it's exactly the same logic, or it's a similar logic, to suggest that organizations can be more distributed as well. So a centralized network, that's where all the people are focused into a single node in the center. Everything's sort of pulled together. And in fact, you could think about the node at the center of that diagram. You can sort of lift it up, and you'd have all of the other nodes hanging down from it. And that's basically the hierarchical functional structure that most organizations are based on these days. Or you can decentralize activity and responsibility to different groups inside the organization. So that's the second diagram. And those groups in terms of organizations could be cross-functional teams, including agile teams, and also communities. So people with a particular passion or interest who will be willing to do something for the organization if they're enabled to do so. And then distributed networks, much more autonomy and radical decentralization, so that everybody has much more autonomy about the work that they're doing. And because I am still mainly a consultant, and I do like my 2x2s, this is the way that I would typically try to describe the opportunity of using centralized, decentralized, distributed networks. So here they're sort of organized diagonally. So the the functional group in the bottom left, then you move up to communities and teams, and then on to distributed networks. But this shows how those three types of network can be seen in organizations as four different types of groups based upon these two dimensions. So more of an internal perspective, functions and communities sort of focus internally on the work and the people inside those groups. Networks and cross-functional teams focus externally. We were hearing about that earlier from Christoph van den Ede at ING, talking about sort of agile teams, focusing on the customer and the work that they needed to get done. And then the vertical dimension here, so functions and cross-functional teams focus on the tasks, the work that needs to get done, and they bring people to doing that work. Whereas on the top line, both communities and networks are much more people-focused. They're about bringing people together and stimulating them around something they're interested in a way that may enable them to do work. So networks don't happen just because there's work to be done. Networks will happen where people want to network with each other. Same as communities. You can't tell a community what to do. As soon as you try to do that, you've no longer got a community. But you can bring people together around mutual passions, and those people can sometimes identify opportunities that they'd like to take up and work on for the organization. And both networks and communities rely on intrinsic rather than extrinsic motivation. And therefore, potentially, although it's a very different way of getting work done, you can potentially get more work done because people are doing things that they want to do. They don't need to be commanded and controlled. They don't need to be extrinsically manipulated to do something. You just need to point them in the right direction, resource them, support them, enable them, and they'll be off doing what they want to do. There is so much opportunity, particularly in today's hard organizational environment, for us to use communities and networks as well as cross-functional or agile teams much more than we do. Perhaps just two more minutes, just to explain a couple of the potential consequences of looking at these four different attributes. And then that should still give me sort of 5 to 10 minutes of questions. Well, Tom and Wuto, hope be really interested to go back to the how remote are organizations going to be, as well as the other attributes we've been having a look at. Trying to identify the consequences of all four attributes together, I think, is quite difficult. But you can sort of take 2 or 3 and just try to look at what might be the consequence in your organization because of doing that. So here, I've just taken remote, asynchronous, and distributed. And this is my suggestion. And again, this is only a potential opportunity. I wouldn't say it's a best practice. I wouldn't say it's a trend. But again, it's something that I'd be having a look at as an opportunity for a best fit strategy in my organization if I was still in HRD. So in terms of being remote, So this is about the way that people can get work done with each other in this new environment. And I've shown the physical workplace at the top here, and then the digital workplace at the bottom. And I've put the digital workplace at the bottom because I think clearly now, but probably going into the future as well, the digital workplace is now the main place that people get their work done. And I don't think that is going to change. So we may not have access to the physical workplace, or when we do, we just think in a much smarter way about how we use it. I saw something on LinkedIn last week. I think it was a workplace design firm who'd constructed this little sort of circular area with a screen wrapped around somebody's desk, and there was just a desk and a chair and the screen and a very small opening into this area, and it was almost like a sort of hermetically sealed area in the office. And the person who was sharing that on LinkedIn was saying, "Oh, isn't this fantastic?" And no, it's not. You know, if that's all you're going to do, come into the office to work on your own in a sealed area, there is no point being in the office. You know, you can get most of what you need done in the digital workplace. The physical workplace is clearly going to be where we can come together to cooperate and collaborate to get things done that we can't get done through the technology. And my bottom line on this diagram is asynchronous technologies, because I think that needs to be our basic focus. You know, if we can get it done asynchronously, we should, because it's more efficient and it's more effective too. So that's the remote aspect and the asynchronous aspect. And in terms of the distributed aspect, I've got those 4 different types of organizational group along the bottom. So individuals or functions, communities, networks, horizontal teams. And absolutely for functions, again, because people tend to spend the time working individually, most of that can get done through asynchronous technologies. You don't need to get everybody together into a big Zoom meeting at the beginning of every day. Horizontal teams will need more time to actually get together, either on social technologies, synchronous technologies, Zoom calls, just to synchronize and make sure that they're aligned over their particular objectives, and in spaces in the physical office as well. And then organizational networks, which I suppose is sort of my main focus within a more distributed organization. The use of social technologies is really key there to help people connect and form those serendipitous connections across our organization. By the way, those distributed type of connections that we get through social technologies, or by meeting in large meeting spaces in the office, or bumping into each other in the corridors, they're the main type of connections that have seen the greatest deterioration during the pandemic, because we're focused on our team connections and relationships, but we're not focusing enough on those more distributed networking connections. So again, for many organizations, it's that distributed focus that is the prime requirement at the moment, partly because it's so important, but also because it has been seriously hit while we've been working at home. And then just finally, so this is just another example of the types of opportunities might be worth thinking about when you look at a couple of the different attributes that I've been describing. So this is about a more heterogeneous workforce and also a distributed organization. So here you've got the distributed nature of organization, the different types of organizational groups I've been talking about on the vertical axis, and along the horizontal, looking at the heterogeneous nature of the workforce, these different workforce categories. I'm sorry, this was something I did for a client fairly recently, looking at reward in organizations, partly just because I think reward does need substantial innovation. We've innovated everything else we do in HR. I don't think we have fully innovated reward, and we need to do so. And I think the time for that has come because of all of the disruption that we've been talking about. So this is just looking at, for each of those different organizational groups and all of the different categories of the workforce, how might we want to reward performance? Again, please don't copy this, because this is best fit for the particular client I did this with, but hopefully serves as an example of the type of thinking and analysis that you might want to do in your own organization, because each of those different cells in that matrix potentially need rewarding in a rather different way. Right, well, I'd love to have spent a bit more time, particularly on those last couple of slides, the last couple of diagrams. But if you do want to know anything more about what I've been describing, you can get in touch with me at all of these different places. There is quite a good description on some of the things I've been talking about in the social organization, and I will be running trainings on all of these different areas in the Strategic HR Academy as well, and all of the various links, LinkedIn, Twitter, etc. But sorry, I have overrun a little bit there, but we've got a few minutes for questions. Tom, Ruta?
Yes, definitely. No, thank you, John. That was brilliant. We still have a couple of minutes left for some questions. Maybe first reflection. I mean, I've always been convinced that HR is hard. And so I definitely like the acronym that you used during the presentation. I was having a discussion last week that maybe for soft skills in HR, we should also find a new word, because this soft is already killing the concept is as such. Anyway, that may be a different discussion. There's one thing that I'm a bit curious about, is that for the last 5 years, I think already, I've been hearing these discussions about we will have more freelance people, we will have more gig workers, more contingent workers, etc. But to be honest, at least on the Belgian labor market and also in KPMG widely, I don't really see this. So my question is, when will this happen? And do you maybe have more facts and figures, how you see this happening in United Kingdom, for instance, or maybe some global figures?
I've not got the figures to hand, but you're right that this has been predicted for sort of 10 years now, and it's not been happening to the extent that has been predicted. But there certainly has been some organizations making a success of using a more contingent workforce. So in consultancy, I think PwC's contingent consultancy platform is working reasonably well for them. And you've got platforms like Catalan, for example. I was asked to bid for a project on there fairly recently. I do think that is going to have a disruptive role in the professional services marketplace. All the factors that made us think seriously about more contingent working, I think, are still there. And I mean, that's why I'm suggesting you have a look at, remote, asynchronous, distributed, and so on. And I think those all put more focus on the need for looking more seriously at the different ways that we can get work done. But I think the biggest factor is, for those organizations that have downsized or are still downsizing or thinking about what the changes might need to be over the next 6 months, this has been such a shock to the system in most organizations. I think a lot of them are going to be seriously reluctant to move back to their existing headcount in a short time frame. I do think potentially there is a factor acting in the opposite direction, which is, I think, for a lot of people who have been in the gig workforce, they found life very difficult. So you could argue, will people want to carry on working as contingent workers? Which is why I think that thing about designing these deals for the benefit of the organization and for the employees or the workers is so important. There are ways to offer flexible contingent working arrangements that people will find very attractive. And I think as long as we do that, yes, my expectation is that the workforce is going to become more heterogeneous in the way that I've been explaining.
Okay, great. Maybe for the last minute, John, if that's okay, I have a question from Ines. Thank you, Ines, for this. She's asking, what is your personal tip to change the organization into a more distributed network?
Thank you. Wonderful question. Thank you very much. Well, can I give you two? Because I think there are a couple of different ways to focus on this. So one is, and the traditional way is more of an organization development type of approach. So looking at connecting people from different parts of the organization. So really simple things like where you're looking at learning opportunities. Absolutely, there is a need for learning in the flow and learning within agile teams and so on. But there's also a broader need to bring people together with others that they don't work with on a daily basis to learn together as well. So use those sort of opportunities to connect people and to network them across the organization. Or just simple things like coffee trials, allowing people to meet up with people that they don't know and have a cup of coffee or a virtual coffee or whatever it may be. And social technologies, so in the pandemic, we know that the use of Microsoft Teams, for example, has gone through the roof. But we haven't seen the same focus into Yammer, for example, which is the more distributed networking type of technology. HR needs to work with IT and technology to help people use the technologies we already have and that we're already using in a more effective way. And then the third thing that I think is getting more and more important, which is sort of really what I was talking about in my presentation. I think we need to start thinking about organization design in a broader way. Certainly not just about functions. We should definitely be thinking about agile teams as well, as Christoph was talking about in the L&D stream earlier on today. But I think we need to think about communities and networks as a real way to organize people. It's a very different way of organizing, but it's organizing people and work. It's just putting the people first rather than work. We really need to have a look at how those opportunities can be used with inside our organizations as well. And some organizations do. GE, for example, they have really well developed networks. They call them communities, but they're what I term networks because they're huge groups of tens of thousands of people organized around the world, which to me isn't a community. But they allow people to bond and form connections and decide to work together to solve organizational problems. That it's a real opportunity that we should be thinking about in a more formal way as well. Thank you very much. Really appreciate the opportunity.
No, thank you, John. It's clearly that you're very passionate about this topic, so that's great. I think it was very insightful. Thank you very much for this. Thanks again. So we are ready now for the next topic because I think those people are already waiting. So thanks again, John. See you later. So the next presentation.